Uh, all right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another VQMS. Today, we're very excited to have Max Pachali tell us about playlists on Spotify. As a reminder, in terms of the rules of the seminar, the panelists should feel free to interrupt at any time to ask questions or clarifications. And attendees, please use the Q&A feature and we'll ask questions on your behalf. And then at the end of the seminar, feel free to stick around and ask additional questions in a more kind of loose discussion. And then this seminar lasts until 1 o'clock. So you have until then, Max. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and Andre, for introducing me. It's my great pleasure to present today, and I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. So today I'm going to present a paper titled "What Drives Demand for Playlists on Spotify," and that's a joint work together with Hannes Datter, who's my colleague at Tilburg University. So today, online platforms play an ever important role in society and economy, and have started to dominate or nearly dominate many industries, such as Amazon in online retailing, Google in search and search advertisement, Facebook in social media, and policymakers around the world are increasingly concerned and call for heightened transparency, right? And there are cases in the US and cases in the EU. And these concerns about the growing power of digital platforms also applies to the music streaming market, where platforms have overtaken traditional revenue streams of content producers. And in the digital age, users mostly consume music through listening to platform-created playlists. And these concerns grew after the rise of playlists on Spotify, that is the leading service, right? And there are voices in the industry stating that playlists are currently the top tool that Spotify is employing to expand their platform empire. Yet, despite all these concerns, not much is known about what drives demand for playlists on Spotify. And why it's important to understand the demand drivers of a playlist choice on music streaming platforms, because it mirrors the power imbalances between music producers on the one hand and sort of the platform on the other hand, right? For example, if users would mainly listen to a playlist because it contains songs of popular artists, it would mean that not Spotify would be powerful, but major record labels that have signed with popular artists, right? And they could then execute power by withholding their popular content from the platform. On the other hand, if users mainly listen to a playlist because of the theme, the mood, or the music topic, or the overall acoustic styles it is representing, all that can be summarized as the playlist brand equity. Curators would be very powerful through their decisions of which artists to include and support with their playlist, right? And in addition, Spotify also featured a selected set of playlists on its app. And if consumers would be very responsive to these kind of promotions of playlists, it would equip Spotify with additional power.
Just a clarification question quickly. So to what extent do listeners create these playlists versus Spotify?
Yeah, so I'm going to have a slide on that as well. And there are a lot of users sort of creating their own playlist. But we see too that sort of the most popular in terms of follower reach playlists on the platform are created by Spotify, right? So because they're going to have an obvious data advantage in terms of sort of knowing what kind of customer wants to have, and they're going to have a very professional way of creating playlists on the platform. Okay. Okay, so the goal of our work is to empirically quantify the main drivers of playlist choice on Spotify in a structural demand model. And our analysis, as we think, relies on quite a unique data set that initially covers 1.2 million playlists in the period of October 2009 till March 2020, collected from chartmetric.com. And the data set, among other things, includes a daily metric for aggregate playlist listeners, the share of content owned by the three major labels, Universal, Sony, and Warner, a proxy for the content popularity of songs on the playlist, the total duration of the playlist, and many more characterizing attributes. And we complement this playlist data set with daily information about which playlists get featured in Spotify's app that we scrape from everynoise.com. And in our empirical analysis, we identify three main factors that affect playlist demand on Spotify. The first is that users have fairly persistent, in the sense of time invariant, preferences for Spotify playlists. And in counterfactual simulations, we show that the market share of platform-created playlists would drop as much as 50% if we replace users' preferences for Spotify playlists by users' average taste for non-Spotify playlists that are substantially lower. And the likely reason for this outcome is that users associate Spotify playlists with strong brands that are formed by professional editors who design a hypothesis and a theme for every playlist. And in addition to that, Spotify has an obvious data advantage, right? Because they observe sort of all the users' listenings, and that's sort of an obvious advantage to sort of design new playlists. And second, we find that users are quite responsive to featuring playlists in the genre and mood browse sections in the app. And we find that the market share of Spotify playlists would drop by about 18% if the platform wouldn't highlight a very selective set of its playlists to users in the app. And last, we find that users also have evaluation for the popularity of added music contents on playlists. However, due to the strong persistence of user preferences, Spotify playlists would only lose about 10% of market share if universal content would be removed from their playlists. Yeah, with regard to the related literature, so there is a growing literature on illustrating Spotify's playlist power. So focusing on about 10 exceptionally popular playlists, Aguiar and Waldvogel in a very related paper documents Spotify's power to influence song and artist success. However, we think that we contribute to this growing literature in the sense that we decompose the main drivers of user demand for playlists using a representative sample of thousands of popular playlists. And in addition, our data also contains daily information about which playlists get featured in Spotify's genre and mood browse sections. And we find that users are quite responsive to these kind of promotions of playlists that we document, or that we sort of document as another source of Spotify's power. And in addition, we shed light on the power imbalances between major music producers and Spotify that has not been shown before. Right, and we think that the mechanisms of our findings are also related to a literature on media power. So in a very recent paper, Simonov and Rao, they estimate very persistent preference for state-owned media outlets in Russia that they document as the main reasons for media power and censored reporting. Right, and in our setting, it's kind of a related mechanism in the sense that users have fairly strong taste for platform-created playlists that are sort of the main driver of Spotify's power over the music producers. Any questions about the intro?
I had a question that I think sort of is echoed in the Q&A, is just how big of a slice of all this is playlists, right? And especially thinking that a lot of playing may happen from people choosing a particular artist and then Spotify just continuing to play things automatically. They're not from any sort of established playlist. So I mean, how much are we missing by focusing on playlists here, essentially?
Yeah, so I think that's actually a very good question. So we don't have quite a one stat about that, but playlist consumption for sure make about 30% of the total consumption, and sort of the remaining consumption likely also is a result of sort of discoveries through playlists, right? Because if you type in an artist, then you will likely also end up at one point in time ending up at the playlist. These can be then automatically created sort of based on individual sort of preferences. But sort of the idea is, I guess, to really create a system of playlists that then once you have sort of consumed the artist that you want to consume, so to speak, that you then end up at a playlist that fits the mood that sort of you currently have, right? Whether you're on the party, whether you kind of want to listen to music while working. So I think that's something. But yeah, that's sort of a difficult number to kind of give a definite answer. But I think the idea of Spotify really is to create playlists and sort of guide consumers in that direction instead of simply listen to Ed Sheeran or Lady Gaga, and then that's it.
And I guess maybe there's plenty of room for the playlists themselves to be a good proxy for what's happening in the rest of recommendation. Is that because I'm just imagining a very common use case is somebody listens to an artist, and then Spotify will start playing other things after they've exhausted whatever that album or that whatever by that artist. And are the, if those recommendations are also driven by the content of playlists, like, co-appearance of songs, then maybe it's a good proxy for that.
Yeah, so we don't sort of observe sort of consumption of sort of recommended tracks, right? So that's sort of not, so here we focus on non-personalized editorial playlists, even though in our sample of the 1.2 million lists, we have sort of specifically recommended playlists sort of to users. So we have a proxy about the recommendation intensity at the platform level, right? So because whenever sort of tracks are added to these personalized playlists, even though we don't observe primary demand or something like that, so we can sort of proxy, or that's also what we do in our empirical analysis. So we're gonna have a control variable for the recommendation intensity at the platform level, right? Because we claim that those playlists that we observe are kind of representative for the overall recommendation intensity at the platform. And then we can see how demand interacts between non-personalized and personalized playlists, right? Substitutional, but these are like great points now. Thanks. Okay, then I would sort of move on with the data sources. So we focus our research on the playlist ecosystem at Spotify. So what are playlists? Playlists are a created list of songs that are typically centered around a particular theme, like here the Deep House Relax playlist by Spotify. Here the genre is Deep House and the mood is relax. It could also be centered around an activity. The mean play duration of playlists are equal to 8 hours on the platform, and there are millions of lists available created by Spotify, major and independent labels, as well as users. And most of the Spotify playlists are managed by professional editors that change compositions on fixed intervals, and they do that mostly at the weekly level. And these editors, they select songs or remove tracks based on the perceived fit with the brand image of a playlist, like here, Forget It and Disappear with Chill House.
Next, quick question. I believe that the playlists are sort of a mixture of, there are some that are editorially curated, but there are some that are algorithmically curated, and maybe some that are actually a combination of the two. I'm wondering if you have a sense from your data of what the distribution might be over those different types of curation, and how that might factor into the downstream results.
Yeah, that's a great question. So unfortunately not. So, and that also goes along with Dean's question. So we don't observe demand for personalized playlists, right? So that's something we cannot sort of say something with our data how the distribution is.
But this is not a question of whether the playlist is personalized. It's a question of, at the, I guess, curation level, you could have a non-personalized playlist that is still curated by an algorithm as opposed to a human editor.
Yeah, that's okay. So okay, I get that. So I think that we strictly don't know that distribution. I agree with you. So it could be like semi-personalized playlists in the sense that sort of there's some kind of personalization going on based on, but we don't know exactly the distribution of really playlists that are only created by editors and only by that have sort of influenced by algorithms. But that's actually a good point. So yeah.
Well, thanks.
So a quick overview of the Spotify landscape. So we have on the one hand editorial playlists like the Deep House Relax that are created by a team of music experts hired by Spotify, and Spotify creates about like 15K playlists and attracting about 63 of all playlist followers in our sample. Then we have playlists by professional creators, like one of the 3 major labels, independent labels that also run their own channels, or tastemakers like artists, radio stations, brands, or influencers that create music. Then we have algorithmically created playlists that are automatically created for each user by Spotify's own software algorithms. And yeah, like sort of users can access these recommendations in the made for you sections. And popular candidates are here the Discover Weekly and Release Radar that are both updated at the weekly level on every Monday and every Friday, respectively. And finally, users can also create their own playlists and share them with one another and generate their own followers for these sort of libraries. Yeah, and in our data, so as I said, our sample contains originally 1.2 million playlists that we obtained from chartmetric.com. And as you can imagine, the follower distribution across playlists is very skewed. So the top 1% of playlists in our sample, so about 12K playlists, add up to a follower share of about 84% of the 1.2 million lists. And about 50% of all playlists tracked have exactly one follower, so they're not shared with other users. And here you see the follower share, the number of playlists, and the mean followers across the different creator types in our sample. And what you can see is that that Spotify playlists attract by far the highest number of followers. And sort of what is also interesting to see is that playlists created by any of the three major labels have a relatively low follower share on the platform. And as I said, so our dataset also contains daily characteristics of playlists. So we observe the share of content owned by the three major labels, a metric for the popularity of content on playlists, so that we proxy by the number of tracks of a playlist added to other playlists at a given date. We observe the number of tracks on a playlist, the average time since release of tracks, that is the track age, the average length of tracks in minutes, and 9 numeric measures characterizing the acoustic attributes on playlists. And as already mentioned, so we also have a metric for the daily variation of the recommendation intensity at the platform level that we proxy by the daily refreshment of personalized playlists in our sample. And the company also reports an estimate of aggregate daily playlist listeners that we use as our metric for demand. And Spotify also featured a selected number of playlists in their app called the Journal and Mood browse sections. And they do that by country and categories, like here for the mood categories, featured playlists. And we retrieve sort of daily data on these featured playlists from everynoise.com in the same period as for the playlist data. And we observe sort of a timestamp, the name of the section where the playlist is featured in, the country name, a list of playlist IDs. And then throughout our sample period, about 7K playlists were featured in any of the sections. And this is a very small fraction of sort of the total playlist in our sample. Yeah, and we merge sort of the featured playlist data with the playlist data by IDs to get sort of the final data set.
I have a quick question. How are these playlists presented to users? Like, I assume Spotify has some control over presenting them to the users, you know?
Yeah, so that's sort of, yeah, you can have sort of the usual Spotify interface, right? Where like the made for you section and sort of, then you can sort of browse through the different sort of categories through like the,
So Spotify controls the ordering of these playlists as a short.
Yeah, and they're like partly like sort of personalized, right? So there's some degree of personalization in there, but not sort of in the in these journal mood browse sections, to the best of our knowledge.
Nice. Another thing that was asked in the chat: what are the motives for this playlist? Is Spotify accounting for the fact that they have to pay royalties to record labels? Do they account for these things when they're? Yeah,
that's sort of also a good question. To what extent Spotify acts strategically here, right? So I mean, so one thing is that where's like the trade-off, right? The trade-off is there that if you have to trade off demand versus like royalties, right? So if you like recommend all the popular stuff to a user, then it may be, or it's very likely the case that you have to pay higher royalties to like the producers of this very popular stuff, right? But that's something that we don't know, right? And sort of they're like big debates, and I think yeah, one can only speculate about that. I will show some statistics where we see what actually the major label share is on featured playlists, but yeah, this is to become later. So we only observe sort of the outcome, but we cannot. Yeah, we don't know what's going on here, but I assume that they're rational, right? So I mean, they need to trade off this in some sense.
Yeah. Max, I have a question actually. How do you distinguish between the active listening and the action of following, in a sense that I could follow a playlist but never listen to it.
Yes, so we don't use the follower stats as our metric for demand. We use an estimate of the daily listeners of a playlist that is sort of generated by chartmetric.com. So we don't use the follower exactly for this reason. We don't use the follower data as our metric for demand.
And does the distribution of listening mimic the following distribution?
There's a correlation that's positive. Yeah, there's a positive correlation, but I can't show you. I can't show you a plot or something, but it's definitely positive. So we've briefly investigated that, but yeah, but we haven't like formally characterized it yet. But that, yeah, so it's good. Yeah, we should do that. I agree. Okay,
Max, just a quick question regarding the listener data that you just mentioned. Can you just say a word about how Chartmetric does it to like infer the number of listeners per playlist?
Yeah. So that's also a sort of kind of their secrets. No, they actually observe the number of streams of some artists, so not a complete list of all artists on the playlist. And they observe that, say, Jay-Z made sort of XYZ streams from sort of a playlist XYZ. And then they observe it for a couple of artists and then take the mean streams sort of for the artists that they observe for like the given playlist. So this metric is with regard to some error. We have to kind of acknowledge that.
So they can observe whether an artist, like the share of streams from a given artist, where it comes from different playlists.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And Max, how is consumption defined here? Because in your descriptive statistics, I think it's the length of one playlist, or the median was about 4 hours. So do we assume that the playlist is consumed when we listen to the entire 4 hours, or to a fraction of it? And if it's a fraction, how much is the fraction?
So it's sort of we actually say that they are in our model that they would sort of listen to it the entire time, or would listen to it sort of a shorter time, but then in a random order, right? So that's sort of.
But the entire playlist.
Yes, or like at a shorter period of time, but then in a random order. So each track would have the same probability of being like streamed during like the time of consumption. Yeah, sort of another important ingredient to our study of demand for playlists is the categorization of the playlist ecosystem. And we use up to 8 keywords associated with playlists in the data to classify playlists into different music genres. And we do this using an association rule machine learning algorithm. And the notion of our categorization is that playlists with similar keywords belong to the same music genre and are hence considered as close to substitutes by users. And the goal of the algorithm is to find joint values of sort of keywords that most frequently occur in the data. So the goal here is mode finding. And we base our classification based on sort of Spotify's predefined genres in the browse sections of featured playlists. So there already have sort of 31 main genres defined. And what we then do is we loop over those 31 main genres and take each time the subset of playlists where the main genre is part of the keywords, and then cast set of association rules for these subsets of playlists in the sense that if keywords A are on the playlist, then keywords B are on the playlist with a certain probability as well. And then we do this 31 times and stack the total rules and get to sort of 145 rules requiring that the consequent B is the main genre. However, one sort of potential concern is that a playlist may be associated with multiple main genres in the sense that some keywords create an association with rock, while other keywords create an association with romance. And to take this into account, our genre categorization takes associations to multiple main genres as separate clusters, in the sense that rock romance is a different category than rock. And here you see sort of the top 10 categories derived from this procedure. And we see that when you see that we categorize playlists based on sort of single main genres like pop and Latin, and combinations of the main genres like pop, R&B, and student. Okay, and let me briefly explain how we get to our final estimation sample that covers about 12K playlists in 50 music categories that still cover 65% of the total followers of the 800K playlist that we were able to allocate into genre categories based on the previous procedure. So we had to drop about 50% of the playlist that only had a single follower and there was no listener data for them available. We select the genre categories belonging to the top 95% of cumulated follower market share with at least 50 playlists included per category to sort of avoid niche categorizations. And within categories, we also focused on the major playlist. And these steps reduced the number of considered playlists to about 30K in 81 categories that still cover 88% of followers of the 800K playlist that we were able to categorize. However, among the 30K playlists, the company only reports listener data for about 12K playlists that finally define our estimation sample. And as already mentioned, we do not rely on the follow data that is a bit more complete, because we think that daily demand is the right measure, or that the daily listeners are the right measure for studying daily demand, and therefore because one can obviously passively follow many playlists without actually listening to them.
Max? Oh, apologies. Yeah. David, go ahead. Thank you. You want to?
Thanks. Max, I was just curious if you had a sense for the playlists that are dropped for the sample, for instance, the ones that are not in the chart metric data. Do you have a sense of what's driving that selection? For instance, does chart metric only cover playlists that have a certain amount of volume, or maybe doesn't have as good coverage for playlists that tend to have artists that are in the long tail? Or is it, I don't know if you have just from looking at the data, if you have any ideas.
That's a very good question. So so with regard to the listener data, the feeling is, which is also estimated, so that's number one. So the feeling is that they are a little bit overestimated, because you probably tend to miss a little bit of the artists that are smaller and maybe in the long tail, in the sense of demand within playlist, put it that way. So we probably a little bit overestimate the metric of demand. And with regard to the playlists that are missing, that's actually, I think that there we don't have a good answer to that, and we should definitely look into this. But it seems that we are missing quite also some sizable playlists. So I don't want to claim that the playlists that we miss are only fringe ones or minor ones. So there are certainly some missing plays, and I think the company is still increasing the number of playlists that they track over time, but that's definitely something that we should further investigate.
So Max, my question actually relates to this as well. I wanted to ask, do you have any statistic for or any idea for a given listener, what is the proportion of them listening to their own playlists or self-curated playlists and those that are curated by others, in the sense that maybe that one playlist that I create is the playlist that I listen to 95% of the time because those are my favorite songs.
Yeah.
Then the other, the ones that you keep in the data are the ones that I occasionally listen to. So somehow it could be a characterization of occasional demand instead of actual demand.
Yeah. So I think it's important to highlight that we only observe aggregate listeners, right? So we don't have access to individual users' listening history. So that's aggregate data. So we have aggregate listening data. So we can't say much about that, unfortunately.
I have another question. To what extent do you think your results that people have strong preferences for, say, Spotify playlists come from the fact that the ordering of these playlists is endogenous? It's given by Spotify. The playlists are not personalized themselves, but the way they're presented to users could be personalized, and they could prioritize Spotify. Now, how do I think about that? Is there any result that could speak to that, perhaps from newer users or heterogeneity across, playlists? Somehow, can I say something about that? Yeah,
I mean, that's part of the power that they have, right? So they can decide about, and that's also what they do, right? In the genre mood browse sections, I will show you in a few minutes a slide. where you see that they're almost entirely featuring their own created playlist, right? So, and that is actually some of the power that they have, right? On the other hand, I mean, users could also satiate, right? So if they would do it in a sense that is sort of tiring them, then they would look for other alternatives, right? So actually that's, and there is kind of some variation, also like exogenous variation, as we claim, that helps us to sort of identify like preferences or separate preferences for the playlist that are sort of time invariant with regard to preferences for like the variation of the content, popularity, and sort of featuring playlist and sort of all that. But yeah, it's sort of the decision which content to highlight is sort of not exogenous, I agree.
So the way I think about this is that when you say preferences, it's the joint preference for, say, ranking and the playlist together. We cannot disentangle these two from each other.
Yeah. So it's like, yeah, I sort of agree to that. It's part of, it could be sort of part of, I mean, we are not sort of randomizing the web design, right? So, I mean, that's definitely impossible. But I think demand is not so simple that the way I present this is sort of deterministic to what I like, right? So that would be a bit kind of disappointing. Okay, looking here, let's move on with some descriptive stats. So here we see the average share of major label content per different creator types. And we see that playlists created by any of the three major labels have by far the highest major label share on their playlist. And Spotify playlists have similar major label share than playlists created by professional creators, for example. And here we see that the higher the major label share on the playlist, the higher the implied content popularity, and that sort of makes intuitively sense because we know that sort of the major labels hire with the most popular artists, like Warner with Ed Sheeran, for example. And also sort of the higher the major label share, the higher also the daily listeners of sort of playlist in our data set. However, one potential concern with these stats is that they do not account for playlist specific demand factors. Right, and we rely on over time variation on the playlist level to pin down sort of the different demand effects. Right, for example, here we exemplify the major label share, the content popularity, and the daily listeners for the housework playlist that's created by Spotify. And we see that the content popularity varies for two reasons. So the first is exogenous, in the sense that sort of the outbreak of the COVID pandemic likely sort of reduced the popularity of house music tracks, but it also varies as a function of the major label share on a playlist, right? So if it goes down, then content popularity goes down as well, and that has an effect on the daily listeners. And here you see a distribution of days on feature across sort of playlists in our estimation sample, and we see that first of all, most of the playlists in our sample are never on feature in at least one of the genre and mood browse sections in at least one country. And if being on featured at all, playlists seem to remain featured in at least one section throughout the whole estimation period. However, note that we have sort of variation in the number of sections the playlist is featured in to sort of learn the effects. And here you see that our sample covers an interesting variation in sort of featured playlists across creator types. Here I plot the share of featured playlists across the different playlist creators. And we see that as of November 2019 onwards, Spotify decided to almost stop featuring major label playlists. It substantially increased the support of its own playlists, right? So for example, before the shift, about 4% of playlists, 4% of featured playlists were created by the major label Universal, and that number drops almost to zero after the shift. And sort of response to the shift, the major label share on sort of featured playlists also decreased substantially and was almost equal after the shift. That can be viewed as evidence for decreasing major label power on Spotify, as sort of, and is in line with what the company declares, in the sense that they want to sort of increase the market share of independent labels and pursues the goal to incorporate new or smaller artists into a variety of places, right? And that's, again, that's what they declare, but it could also well be that this is just an action to sort of reduce the royalties that they have to pay to the content producer, because it's very likely that a non-major label share or non-major label artists sort of get smaller royalties, but that's obviously unobserved. And here we see that sort of the daily listeners on featured playlists are quite higher than sort of the daily listeners of non-featured playlists, and that suggests that featuring playlists in sort of Spotify's genre mood browse sections is effective in stimulating demand. Yeah, are there any questions with regard to the stats?
Just a quick question, Max. This drop in the share of promoted playlists from majors, do you know like this time frame, if anything else was happening, like were they like negotiating royalty rates or something?
I don't have a definite answer to that, so there are only like block. Yeah, no, I can only speculate and I don't have any definite answer. So it's but it's really interesting to further explore that, right? Because that looks very interesting. I agree. Yeah, so let me then introduce sort of our demand framework. So on a high level, we think about playlists as sort of products that are sort of differentiated by acoustic attributes, content popularity, play duration, creator type, and so on. And as said, every playlist has its own theme or hypothesis, and users have different preferences for these kind of brands of playlists, right? And users can choose among thousands of differentiated alternatives, and we model this decision as a discrete choice. And more formally, at every day, users choose between listening to one of the playlists on Spotify or consuming content and competing music streaming platforms. And what is sort of the market definition here? We define the market as the total number of premium subscribers of the 7 leading music streaming platforms. And in modeling this, we neglect the impact of fees on platform choice, as monthly fees are almost homogeneously set across platforms and equal $10. And at every day, every consumer in the market chooses an alternative P from the available set that maximizes utility. And our utility specification is quite standard, as we have a mean utility component for playlist P and T that we detail on the next slide. We have an unobserved time varying playlist popularity or quality term, and we have a random component of sort of playlist demand. And let me sort of detail the empirical specification. So gamma P denotes users' time invariant preferences for playlist P. Then we have eta that measures the effect of featuring playlists in Spotify's genre and mood browse sections, and NPT is the number of the number of sections playlist P is featured in aggregated over countries. Then we have beta that measures the user's sensitivity to fluctuations in the content popularity. Then we have omega that measures the effect of personalized recommendation intensity. So if that sort of coefficient would be negative, it would mean that the demand for sort of non-personalized playlists would drop in response to sort of a more recommendation going on at the platform level, right? And then these two play alternatives would be like considered as substitutes and not complements by users. Then we have a bunch of control terms, and we partition the playlist into 50 nests that we obtained from the machine learning playlist categorization I sort of detailed earlier. And our estimation is fairly standard, and we follow Berry 1994 and estimate the model via OLS. They're talking about heterogeneity, so we use instruments to correct for the potential heterogeneity in the timing of featuring playlists and within nest market share. And for playlist featuring, we use the daily number of genre and mood sections that very small playlists are featured in that belong to the 10% of observation with lowest followers in the same category. And the intuition for this instrument is that sort of the decision which playlists to feature within categories are likely simultaneously coordinated to increase cost efficiency, so that makes this instrument relevant, but very small lists unlikely affect demand of the major list because they're really in different markets, mainstream list versus niche playlist. And for the mechanical heterogeneity of the within nest market share variable, we use a BLP type instrument given as the sum of play duration of competing playlists at every day. And that instrument is exogenous, so unrelated to playlist specific shocks, because the expansion of tracks on the platform rather reflects supply and not demand shocks. but negatively correlates with sort of within nest market share if there is sort of a supply shock in the market. And in addition, creators may also change compositions in response to daily shocks, right? So that's another concern that we have here. However, industry insiders suggest that playlists get updated on fixed intervals that is mostly on a weekly level, right? And looking into our data, so here we plot the average update frequency in days across playlists in our estimation sample. We see that the mean median average update frequency equals 12 and sort of 8 days. So, and that suggests that the majority of sort of creators do not adjust based on daily shocks, and that the lion's share of variation in our sort of data holds the strategic decision of the creator content. And that sort of approach closely follows Rossi 218, who proposes to deal with endogeneity by sampling data at a much higher frequency than strategic decisions are made. Yeah, looking at the regression results here, I show the nested loaded regression results between the OLS model and the IV model. So first of all, we see that featuring more playlists in Spotify's browse sections positively affects user demand, and that the IV model corrects an underestimation in the OLS model. And we also see that content popularity positively affects user demand, and the effect of recommendation intensity is negative, suggesting that users are considering non-personalized and personalized playlists as substitutes and not complements. And we see that sort of the IV model corrects an overestimation of the sigma parameter in the OLS model. Yeah, here I show the relation between sort of playlist preferences and static followers, and that sort of relation is positive, as one would expect. And we see that we get the highest playlist preferences for playlists created by Spotify. And what's also interesting to see is that a high number of followers does not necessarily translate into high time invariant preferences, right? And that's precisely why we need the demand model, because sort of having sort of, there are many reasons that could rationalize a high number of followers, right? So being like featured or sort of a high content popularity, and sort of we need the model to pin down these different effects. I see a question, or
Max, yeah, there are a few questions there. So JP has a pretty involved question, but I think he wants more clarification about why you have a demand model versus just presenting descriptive evidence. And is the major concern the fact that Spotify can modify the offerings on the playlist in response to the demand shocks? So I think that's the question.
So, I mean, it's not that Spotify can sort of react or change the compositions in response to the demand shock. It's sort of more like that the creators would do that, right? And if we observe that the creators don't do that at a daily level, but we are sort of collecting the data at the daily level, so we can sort of assume that even if they would sort of strategically account for every sort of demand shocks that they might be sort of, or that we don't control for, it would still mean that there's a lot of variation, or the majority of variation that we have in the data would sort of hold that strategic decision constant, right? And that would help us to pin down, or sort of we would have a lot of variation that is not contaminated by sort of any endogenous sort of adjustments of sort of creators.
Okay, so I think you just said this, but then you view the main purpose of the demand model to decompose
yes
the effects of highlighting the playlist versus how good the playlist is, and some
exactly.
abstract sense.
And I think looking at this plot helps, right? So because we see there are a lot of playlists that have high number of followers, but they don't have sort of high time invariant preferences, right? So user preference, and that's exactly what our demand model does, right? Because it pins down all the different sort of explanations for high number of followers, right? It could be like that they are featured all the time. It could be that they have the hottest content added. And there is some exogenous variation over time, and that helps us to sort of pin down the different effects, right?
And then I guess the follow-up question is then why this particular functional form?
Yeah.
Why not a more flexible demand model?
Yeah, I mean, we can sort of, yeah, that's sort of always a good question. Yeah, we can sort of, we kind of found that sort of the logarithm here helped us to sort of get a higher fit. So that's why we did that, and we think that the log form here makes sense. But we can definitely play around with more flexible specification. I don't want to say that that's not useful.
Okay, and then another question is from Siddharth Pursti. A discrete choice model assumes single choice amongst available products. How valid is this assumption for Spotify?
Yeah, so we think that the consumption moment is, so when you want to listen to a playlist, then you certainly have to make, or when you want to listen to music on Spotify, then you certainly have to make a discrete choice decision, right? Because you cannot consume the music simultaneously, right? So, and that's sort of our idea here. Okay, then sort of in the interest of time, I would sort of move on with sort of some counterfactuals. So the idea of the counterfactuals are twofold. So first, we want to compare the magnitudes of the main factors of playlist demand, in the sense that by asking ourselves by how much would the market share of Spotify created playlists drop if they wouldn't be associated as such strong brands by users. And second, if they wouldn't be featured in the genre and mood sections anymore, and if they wouldn't contain any popular major label tracks anymore. So the first two counterfactuals could be considered as the power of the platform, right? Because this is in the hands, or this is sort of the equity that the platform has. And the last scenario illustrates sort of the power of the content producers, right? By how much the playlist of Spotify depend on having a sort of popular major label tracks.
Sorry, Max, maybe I missed this or forgot, but what does it mean in 1A to be associated as a strong brand? Like operational, what does that actually mean?
Okay, so that would mean that in the utility function, you would get a sort of a high time invariant sort of preference term, right? So that would be a fixed effect. And that's sort of, okay, strong, I should say, strong preferences, right? So they're like strong time invariant reasons why you listen to that playlist, and that's sort of what we mean here. And sort of, yeah, I kind of gave that interpretation here, but yeah, it's a high time invariant preference for a playlist.
Can I clarify about the source of variation in content on the playlist? Should we think about this as what identified there's like one time there was a big shock in the composition of playlist, and then for a while it stays the same? Or it's day-to-day, on the day-to-day level, there is shifts in what type of content is on the playlist. The reason I'm asking is, do we think about this variation? Is there some short-term variation and people don't have time to internalize it? It's content very different, or it's like long-term and people have like enough time to form expectations what type of content is on the playlist?
Yeah, so that's actually a great question. So it's not sort of it's sort of not a sort of long-term variation, right? So it's like I would think, and we are like currently experimenting with like different definition of what content popularity is, because it could be that on a short term, if you decide listening to a playlist, that you just scan the first 10 tracks or something like that, and then decide based on this which playlist you choose, right? So and then you kind of miss the whole variation beyond that, right? And that's sort of something that we should take into account. But as you've seen, so there are like two reasons why like the content popularity could vary. So first, that there are no sort of creative decisions, which could be like potentially endogenous, but like it's hard to kind of learn all these sort of specific demand shocks at a given day. And sort of what also helps us are like shifts like COVID, right? Where like some categories really became like really unattractive, and then sort of the content popularity went down, and then we see how sort of users shifted their demand in this sort of this respect. Yeah, but it's not that there's like an everyday update of these playlists, right? I've showed that stat that the average update frequency of playlists is like seven days.
Right. I mean, just to clarify, the reason I was asking is we know from like other Pandora paper on ads and other papers that people react slowly to like changing level of ads. It takes a while for people to internalize that it changed. And I wonder if there is a way to separate out the kind of immediate responses of people here to content versus longer term? Because counterfactual, I think, more in the long-term domain, like if they remove the content. And that's why I bring this up.
Yeah, I'm not even sure whether it's long-term counterfactual, right? It could also be a short-term, right? That you don't learn it in a short term, that sort of there is no major label tracks sort of in there because there are just so many tracks on the playlist, right? So could even be that we are like here showing the short-term counterfactual, and in the long term, if you learn that these tracks are missing on your playlist, then you go somewhere else, right? So that's actually, I mean, we only observe sort of aggregate listeners, right? So that's kind of what we still work, or we're currently working on the rank data, right? So, and I think that will help us, right? Because if something is at the top of sort of listed at the top, then I think you have more attention to that. And if we see that those variation in those sort of tracks is more sort of drives more sort of the listener data, I think that would sort of give evidence that people don't scan through all the songs when they make a decision. Okay, are there like other questions?
Yeah, Max, thank you for the research. Super interesting. How would things change in your model when taking into account, to Dave's point earlier, the personalization that happens, especially like you open search, you go and you, for example, see your top genres as well, right?
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's sort of, yeah, I think that would kind of require that we observe user data, right? But that's actually something that we don't have, right? So we don't have access to individual user data, but only observe sort of the playlist listenings at the aggregate level, right? So we can unfortunately say something about that. Yeah, so I think I have to sort of acknowledge that that's something that's very difficult for us to incorporate it into this study. Okay, so I think in the interest of time, I sort of move on and show some results. So here you see the simulated changes in playlist market share if users would have substantially lower time invariant preferences for Spotify playlist. And we simulate this by setting the preferences for Spotify playlists equal to the average user preferences for non-Spotify playlists that are substantially lower. And in this counterfactual, you see that the simulated market share of a Spotify created playlist would drop substantially by about 14 percentage points. And that just shows that that users have very strong taste for Spotify playlists. That are one of the main reasons for the high market share that they're realizing. And compared to that, here we illustrate the simulated changes in playlist market share if Spotify playlists don't get featured in the browse sections, and that would induce a reduction in market share of about 5 percentage points. So next, we want to sort of contrast these counterfactuals to the question to what extent Spotify playlists are dependent on having popular major label tracks, right? And to do that counterfactual, we need to predict the counterfactual content popularity of a playlist absent any major label tracks being added. And we use the following simple yet flexible specification. So the dependent variable here now is content popularity. And we sort of use these non-zero terms indicating that a curator always wants to have some superstar content of sort of major labels added to the playlist, and we combine this with linear terms. So we also now currently working on more flexible sort of models here. So this is about to come. However, using this auxiliary regression, we can then simulate the changes in playlist market share if Spotify playlists removed all tracks released by Universal, for example, here. And that would induce a reduction of only about 2.7 points of market share, and that's a very small number compared to the two other scenarios that I've just shown to you. And sort of that means that sort of users, very much values a Spotify playlist, and that sort of Spotify, on the other hand, is much less dependent on having popular major label tracks added to their playlist, right? And another side of this coin is that sort of music producers, the revenues of music producers are very dependent on Spotify's editorial decisions, right? And to illustrate that, let me define major labels L, revenues from editorial playlists on Spotify that can be expressed as follows. So here we sum over the playlist on Spotify, excluding the outset good, where we have the market share of playlist P, times the number of songs released by major label L times the market size and the per stream royalty rate. And with that, we can simulate the percentage change of producers' revenues on Spotify in the 3 scenarios of no major label tracks on featured playlists. So what would happen if they would drop major label tracks from featured playlist in the app? So then we see that in the diagonal elements that all music producers would lose a substantial amount of revenues, right? And all the reason why the off diagonal elements are negative is that in this scenario, the content popularity drops too, right? So if you remove universal tracks from a playlist, then this playlist will become less attractive. And even though those tracks that stayed on the playlist will receive less demand, right? Yeah, let me sort of wrap this up. So we study sort of the demand drivers of playlists on Spotify using sort of a good, quite unique data set on daily listeners and characterizing attributes of about 12K playlists. And we find that users mainly choose Spotify playlists for time invariant reasons that we think most likely result because they associate these playlists with very strong brands. And the company employs a large body of professional editors who help creating their own hypothesis and theme, that is sort of the brand equity of a playlist. And in addition, we also find that users are quite responsive to featuring playlists in the genre and mood browse sections, which we identify as another part of Spotify's power. And in relative terms, sort of user demand is much less responsive to fluctuations in the popularity of added tracks on playlists. And what are the implications? So first, we see that revenues of major labels and also music producers more broadly largely depend on Spotify's editorial decisions about playlist composition and featuring playlists in the genre and mood browse sections. And in relative terms, Spotify is much less dependent on the availability of popular major label tracks on its playlist, right? And to reduce sort of Spotify's playlist monopoly in some sense and an increased competition, music producers and other creators should further invest in growing both the quantity and the brand equity of their own playlist channels on Spotify. So thanks for your attention and all the great questions. So that was very helpful feedback. I look forward to further discussing this.
Thanks, Max. So you finished just on time. At this point, we'll open up for kind of a more general discussion. And if any attendees want to be promoted to ask questions, please raise your hand and we'll promote you. And otherwise, I think you can start by answering maybe Klaus's question: would consumer welfare decrease due to the removal of playlists?
Yeah, so in sort of our model, yes, it would remove, because you would lose an epsilon error, sort of in the logit model, which always decreases welfare. No, but yeah, so in sort of our sense, and sort of that's actually that's our point 3 of our recommendation, is that sort of it would help if sort of there would be more competition in sort of the creation of playlists, right? Because we have seen that the follower share of playlists created by the content producers is fairly low, right? And that's quite surprising. It seems that they just didn't really understand the notion of sort of a playlist on sort of the platform, or don't have sort of the abilities to create a lot of playlists that attracts a large number of followers. And we think if there are more creators, more independent creators of playlists, then that would be good for music producers more broadly, not only the major labels, but also smaller creators, because then there's sort of less of this monopoly where the platform decides about which playlists get sort of a large number of followers and sort of because they are in the control of the creation of these playlists and sort of which sort of artists to add and support, and yeah, that's in the long term, I think, also not good for consumer welfare. Yeah.
Sorry, do we just, I didn't know, I had my hand up, but I don't want to speak out of turn if someone was ahead of me.
I don't think so.
Okay, you can go for it.
Okay, very well. So first of all, Max, I really like this. I think this is really interesting. I think this is it's interesting because this is a data territory that there hasn't been a lot of work on. So I was really curious to see what you had to show. And I have my recommendations are more like cosmetic, maybe call these editorial. But I'd really recommend as you're rewriting the paper and you're giving future talks, you consider positioning it around what you've got in the current slide. So I mean, I had a lot of questions like, why do you need a demand model? Why do you need a nested logit functional form? And I think the answer is, the big picture question is about theories as to these power imbalances that are being created with online platforms. It used to be that the content providers owned, the publishers owned the channel, right? I mean, people talk about the horrible contracts that the music producers would impose on artists, and things have kind of changed now with Spotify, right? I mean, you can self-produce and you might even get airtime. And so your question is broadly about these power imbalances, and you just be upfront that you're not going to be studying the supply side interrelationship. But obviously a big ingredient into understanding these power imbalances is understanding people's preferences, like what drives them to select different kinds of songs. And for that, I agree there are two reasons that you need a demand model, a functional form model. The first one is you can't just regress viewership shares on non-parametrically on all these music attributes, because you talk about these things aren't randomly assigned. There's a lot of strategic decisions by the publishers and so forth. And I think that's really good. I wish we'd spent a little more time on the sources of endogeneity and a little more time on the instruments, because I think that's the heart of your paper is, can you actually get this causality right? And then the second reason you need the functional form is so you can do this exercise at the end. That actually I found interesting. It's very simple, but I still found it interesting, which is, what does demand look like as you take away some of these attributes? And the evidence seemed pretty suggestive to me, even without a supply side model, that the role of popular artists has changed a lot, but that doesn't seem to be a big determinant. And that seems to suggest that Spotify has a lot more power than these platforms. If you wrote this paper up, like, I mean, this is just my personal opinion, so free disposal.
It's perfect.
If you wrote this up concisely and shortly that way, I would be really, I think that would be a really nice paper. It's very interesting. And then we could focus more on, did you get the causality right? Because that's key. Because if you just punt on that, then who knows what this little exercise is teaching us. But if you really spend a lot of time, how are these playlists determined? And why do we think there's endogeneity? Why do you think you have instruments? Not sure why you have the nested logit, since that just exacerbates endogeneity unnecessarily, but that's a different matter. Anyhow, I'll be quiet now, but I just wanted to say I really enjoyed it, and I'd really recommend rewriting and repositioning this to flesh out why your strategy was necessary. And I don't think learning people's preferences is in and of itself super interesting, but it is when you answer these questions about power imbalances.
Thank you, JP. So like very, I would say I sort of agree with the sort of 80%, 90% with all you said. So the causality is sort of is like the tough one, because they are obviously endogenously created, so there are endogenous decisions going on. But we think like a very good argument is, beside these instruments that we have for the sigma term and sort of the decision about which playlist to create, is that we have the daily data, right? So that kind of holds a lot of the strategic decisions. So there is like data that is likely contaminated by endogeneity, right? Because I mean, there are updates of sort of created playlists and sort of, but we show that they do it mostly at the weekly level, and we have kind of daily data. So there are like other reasons why like the content popularity and sort of other things vary over time, and also creators update at different frequency, right? So that's also like they're not updating at the same day for all playlists. So there is kind of variation going on or left that we think is sort of likely exogenous or quasi-exogenous, controlling for all the fixed effects. I think we kind of need the nested logit model. I mean, if we only had this as an aggregate logit, I'll be sort of very, very sort of worried about the sort of errors, right? Because we have a lot of sort of alternatives. We have about 12K playlists in those, and then also all these logit errors that then start to play a role. And I think this nested logit thing is kind of nice and useful here, because
I just mean, why do you need discrete choice at all? I mean, somebody asked earlier, do people really they choose one playlist, or do they listen to multiple ones? I was just not sure you needed that per se. The only reason I could see to use nested logit or some variant of discrete choice is we've got really convenient instrumental variables approaches. But if the only thing you're instrumenting is the nested logit share, then it sort of seems like circular reasoning. Like, why then don't use the nested logit?
It's not the only thing, right? We also have an instrument for the decision of playlist featuring, so that's sort of number two. And we can also think about instrumenting sort of the content popularity, right? So we have actually access to the followers of artists added to the playlist from Instagram or Deezer, so other external like social media stats that we could also sort of kind of bring into this. But yeah, we have to kind of think about this too. Yeah, and the quantity demand model, or like can some kind of satiation. I mean, I'm not sure. So
no, you convinced me already. You convinced me. If you're right, if there's a whole bunch of critical features that you want to instrument for, and that then I agree that the discrete logit's probably good enough in this situation, and it's just a convenient way to do IV.
Yeah. But I would also be interesting to learn how to do sort of these quantity models, or like satiation models, to put that way, with like aggregate data. I mean, I've sort of never done that, but yeah, that could be simply my my kind of limitations. But thanks for this feedback. This is amazing. We will clarify that and sort of I think better motivate why we need the demand model is like awesome to kind of explain, or because it really mirrors the power imbalances, as you said, between like content producers and sort of the platform. So I think that's actually great to highlight. Yeah.
Max, I had a comment, but I think Louis had a hand for a while. I'll just let him go first.
Thanks. Yeah, so just a comment probably related to what JP said about the bigger picture and the Spotify's power. So as you said earlier, the big power they have is that they own the real estate where they're going to show which playlists are going to be featured, right? And so I'm just wondering if an interesting counterfactual exercise would be, well, what if there's suddenly a policy that forces Spotify to show 10% of playlists on this featured playlists that are not from Spotify. So for instance, the Commission has the European Commission has forced Netflix and SVOD platforms to have 20% or 30% content that is European. So I'm just wondering if that would, how could that affect consumer welfare, for instance? Because one may say, okay, maybe Spotify is going to abuse that power and just push content that is beneficial for them, but not necessarily for consumers. But you may also say, well, they know better about consumers' preferences, and so it might be actually better for consumers to have access to Spotify's playlists rather than other ones. So I was wondering if you could play around with that on your.
No, I think that's also a very interesting sort of direction, and I would sort of, because that's something in my mind now. I mean, how could a policymaker step in here, right? I mean, that's actually difficult, and if so, something like the quota that you have mentioned could be one way, but I wasn't aware of that, so that's very good to know. So then you could. I mean,
no, so I don't think that's a policy that's on the table. I'm just,
but I was kind of thinking about which. I mean, how could you like regulate, or how could you like break this kind of power of like a platform, and yeah, that could be one way that you kind of state like. But I kind of have to think about the effectiveness, right? Because if you say X% of your featured playlist, I think that would be fair, right? If sort of a certain sort of non-Spotify playlist must sort of get a certain percentage of like feature share, right? So that you kind of also feature or suggest playlists to users that are not created by the platform, right? Because then it would give like a fairer share to other artists at the end of the day, right? Because as we've seen, sort of playlists that are created by major labels have higher major label share, created by independent labels have higher independent label share, right? So then you would also like take a little bit away Spotify's power from creating these top playlists.
This is kind of related also to the debate around Amazon, whether they should be able to sell on their own platform. Now, Spotify doesn't have their own content, but that's their own playlist, so I guess you can draw a parallel with that too.
No,
I was thinking about this issue as well, of just like the choice to be able to promote playlists, and why would that involve less power for Spotify? And I guess one of the answers I came up with is that, well, playlists are combinatorial, and especially if the average playlist is 4 hours long, Spotify can't just pick the playlist that somebody else has created that has exactly the content that they want to promote in it. And so there's some imprecision in that intervention. And I don't know, I guess that's maybe an interesting thing to articulate, right? Is why can't Spotify just say, you know what, we don't need our own playlists. We just will feature playlists that already have the content on it that somehow we want to promote. And maybe they can't do that because it's too high dimensional. But this also made me wonder, because in a lot of ways, I would imagine a lot of human curated playlists on Spotify that are not built by Spotify are in fact built in part by Spotify's algorithms. If you start creating a playlist, Spotify starts suggesting what you ought to add to the playlist. And so I could imagine that it's easy for them to indirectly influence the production of playlists that have what they want.
Yeah, and I was also thinking about consumer welfare here, right? It's not so obvious that the consumers are currently suffering from that, right? It's because it could simply be that they have like the right technology, they have the data to kind of create the playlist that sort of consumer wants, right? So we don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing that these playlists are so super sort of high in demand, right? That there are so many followers. The only thing you need to be aware of is that then the platform is actually, or Spotify is actually sort of has a very high control about which producers become successful in the future or not, right? So and that is actually, that can be good in the long run, right? So because then sort of now they're saying they want to push sort of independent label artists, but it could also be that they just want to break major label power, right? And sort of improve their bargaining position over sort of major label artists, right? So that's just something that you cannot verify. And then in the longer run, if sort of it becomes more and more unprofitable for producers to be in the market, then guess what? Then Spotify will also become a label, I think. And then these are kind of things that should be avoided as sort of a regulator here. But that's I think also our point, kind of, that, as you said, Dean, that it would be, maybe it's not possible yet, and we don't want to say that Spotify is evil or something, right? It could just be that they have a very good technology and then sort of doing the right things. But it would be nice, or it would be desirable from an economic perspective, that there would be more competition among creators, right? And that different creators get a fair chance of like being like visible on the platform. I think that would be very important from a long-term perspective in this music market.
I think like a couple of things. Like, one is on the last point you just mentioned, which I had something else in mind, but given you mentioned this, it's not obvious to me why in this case we want to promote, like, our objective is to promote always independent artists, right? Because music, to produce very high quality music, you need to invest fixed costs, and so maybe there is a reason for this. Like, and I can see there is like a very common theme in all this, like, support independent small artists. There is some built-in argument that people have, like there is long tail preference, and people have variety seeking. But I guess maybe like more clear why, like, to what extent you want to push that would be helpful.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and that was part of it what I was saying before. So maybe it's just that they do the things that consumer demand, right? So they're just, everything what they do is totally demand driven, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think the only thing we are saying, and we want to that people understand, is that in the current situation, right, it's like they might do the right thing and they might do what consumers want, but they could very easily abuse that power, right? And sort of say, oh, if we sort of have a different, or if we have a difficult situation with label A, then we just reduce their share in sort of a promoted playlist, and then sort of they would suffer a lot. If they have that with label C, then they could do that too with label D. So, and at the end of the day, all these labels would be like marginalized, right? And then sort of and that can be good, right? So so we're not arguing.
I think that's exactly right. So I think that's like trying to understand how much the push for Spotify to have like more independent artists, how much of this was Spotify's perspective, kind of they're like trying to decrease their rent, like royalties, versus how much it's actually beneficial to consumers. I'm not sure how much you can say with the data you have, but it seems like a big important, like it can go either way. It relates to a different point, and I think this is to Henrietta's question about how recommendations fit into the story. First is, to me, it sounds like if you include recommendations to this, if anything, Spotify's power should be high because they have information about what people listen to, and like they can choose what to show to people, and they have information. So if anything, I think it should suggest they would have more power on the platform. I think I guess Henrietta is great. So Henrietta is director of research at Spotify. So it's clear like they focus a lot on this, I guess, on algorithm and suggested this. So I could see, I guess, maybe thinking through that would be helpful for this. And so the third thing, and I'll stop at this three almost separate, related but independent points. I wonder if there is so part of the reason why Spotify might want to promote independent artists is that people have variety seeking in how they consume music, and I wouldn't be surprised if the more variety of music I listen to, it forms even more preference for variety. I now I learn to it's easier for me to learn which brands are out there. It's easier somehow. I wouldn't be surprised if this tastes a bit more complex than what we typically think about CPG groups or some simpler, where it's not like I have built-in taste and I want just variety of yogurts. It has the more different types of music I listen to. It creates even higher demand for variety. And that's where this will be another suggestion why Spotify really tries to give you a lot of independent artists, because then you'll demand even more independent artists afterwards.
Yeah, no, that's totally right, and I think that's in line with Hannes and Bart's and George paper, where they show that if you adopt to online streaming, then you consider more sort of a variety artist and less sort of superstar, which makes sense, right? So if you don't listen to at Spotify all the time to Ed Sheeran or Lady Gaga or Rihanna, right? So you want these mood playlists and sort of all that, and I think that there's not so important that it's a superstar added to that, but rather music that sort of fits your current consumption needs, right? And that makes sense. But on the other hand, so there's a recent paper by Lewis, right? So who also show that sort of Spotify playlists are biased. You say biased, right? So they are biased towards sort of independent label artists, right? That they surprisingly feature sort of more independent label artists, right? So that sort of would suggest that even though there would be actually in the sort of given preferences, there would be more demand for a major label tracks than sort of they have a very high share of sort of independent artists on there. And the reasons why that's the case, one can only speculate. But it doesn't seem to be the case that Spotify is favoring a lot of major label artists in their current sort of creation decisions. And that's also what we've seen in this plot about sort of the featured major label tracks on the platform. It was really equalized, right? And you would expect that there is a little bit of a gap, but that gap got closed sort of over our sort of sample period. So it's very interesting that they closed it, but it's extremely difficult to pin down or rationalize why they are doing it, right? So you could rationalize it by variety, saying that users want more independent labels or sort of more variety and not only the major label stuff. But on the other hand, it could just simply be that it's just cheaper for them because they have to pay lower royalties. So that's actually what I kind of think as a rational creator, right? So you would kind of balance that out, right? And in the long run, if you always reduce sort of the fraction of major label artists where you have to pay more at the long run, so if you break the label power, then there would be only fragmented labels left, and then as a result of that, you would need to have you would need to pay lower royalties to all of these fragmented labels as if they are major labels, right? Because they have a better bargaining position. So if that could also be one argument why they're doing it, but it's really difficult to kind of rationalize these different sort of stories here. But it's certainly a very sort of, and with regard to recommendations, I agree that our current power metric lacks the recommendation side. So the actual power of Spotify should be higher, right? Because they still can exercise power by recommending stuff to users that is not covered in our analysis. So we should write that in the paper that probably that's a very conservative estimate of sort of power because we cannot really account for the power through recommendations.
Max, just one minor thing. I think prior to 2018, which Spotify IPO'd, about 20% of Spotify is owned by the 3 large labels and 2 other players.
Yeah.
And they have been slashing their stakes.
Yeah.
They have been slashing their shares towards 2019 and 2020. So they have been selling off their shares. Now, other players in the market, as far as I know, they have accused Spotify of getting better deals with record labels because record labels have a larger stake. The SEC filings have, they have to, basically say how much of it is owned by Sony, Warner, stuff like that. Yeah. I wonder if it's because these folks are, cashing out. Now they don't get those favorable deals anymore. They have to sort of be strategic about the royalties now. I don't know whether that's at play, but certainly the shares of Sony, Warner, and Universal are dropping. I mean, it stakes in Spotify over 2018 to 2020.
Yeah, and that makes perfectly sense what we see here, because they're not really dominating sort of the creation decisions, because Spotify playlists don't have a higher major label share on their playlist than sort of other more independent creator types, right? And if they would really be influential in this market, they would really dictate and say, we want a major label share on featured playlist of 60, 70%, right? Because that increases demand and that increases then streams at the end of the day. So yeah, I think that makes totally sense. Yeah.
Cool. Anyway, it seems like a lot of great discussion prompted by this paper. Thanks for sharing this with us.
Well, thank you guys for like all the feedback. It's sort of amazing, and yeah, we will definitely use that for revising the paper.
Cool.
Thanks, Max, and thanks everyone for joining for the discussion.
Yeah.
It was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.